So let me begin by expressing my gratitude to everyone involved for giving me this opportunity to talk to all of you. Having said that, I know I should also be a bit apologetic because it's like 3:30 in the afternoon, not the best time for people to be in rapt attention. But so I would like to thank you for your patience and having decided to listen to me. As a kind of introduction, I must say that I was pleasantly surprised to see that the first session in this webinar, in the sense, the first session after the inauguration in this seminar is on sexuality. I'm using a forbidden term, I know. Normally, I would expect such a session to be somewhere towards the fag end of the seminar, because generally, sexuality is still considered as a taboo term or a taboo topic and not worth projecting or not worth announcing prominently or whatever. So in fact, I should congratulate the organizers of this seminar for putting this as the first session in the workshop. Okay. So I have a very brief presentation called Treading Forbidden Territories, doing literary research, literary research and sexuality. That's the title of my presentation. And I shall make use of a small PowerPoint to make a brief presentation. And since this is more of a workshop, it would be nice if you can come up with your responses and questions so that we can have a truly interactive session after my brief presentation. Is that okay for everyone? So that's the way I'm planning to go. So I shall begin by talking about the issue of sexuality and literature. All of us know that even today, when there is a whole lot of debate going on these subjects, sexuality is a topic about which we generally observe silence. And all of us know the reason for it. As Jeffrey Weeks, the well-known historian from UK, has observed, sexuality often functions as a conveyor belt for various social anxieties. In fact, as the society progresses, there are numerous kinds of social anxieties emerging in social formations. And most of the time, all these anxieties eventually get posited on to the topic of sexuality. Thus, sexuality and its ally, that is the body, become battlefields where struggles for power are constantly waged. And this is particularly so in the case of people who are considered as the sexual subalterns. And I won't have to tell you who are the sexual subalterns. Women, children, people who apparently are different from others. They are all the sexual subalterns. And their desires and bodies become the battleground over which... Is there a problem? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Over which different kinds of power struggles are waged. And all these are pointed out as reasons that complicated the relationship between literature and sexuality. Because, as we also know, on the other side, art is most of the time considered as a privileged field of expression and interaction. And aesthetic pleasure is evaluated as something that is spiritual or divine. Naturally, the link between art and sexuality has always been a complicated one. The moment there are engagements, expressions of sexuality, the value of art is generally assumed as going down. So, any form of art in which sexuality features prominently is considered as low art. All of us know that even now, even before we mention a film in which, a well known actress, Shakila, the moment we talk about Shakila film, a lot of people start smiling because Shakila film is considered as low art,
Muraleedharan, sir.
whereas the movies of very, how do I say, I mean, very decent actresses, quote unquote, decent actresses, are considered as highly respected forms of art. So, this is the kind of background in which we are
Yes,
going
sir.
to talk about the
Sir, I'm sorry to interrupt.
relationship between sexuality
Sir,
and art. Uh, uh, oh, the PowerPoint is not visible to you. Okay. Oh, sorry. Maybe I
yes, sir,
have
it's not visible.
clicked the wrong button. Okay, I'll see if I can do that. I'm sorry about that. Is it visible now? Can somebody tell me
Yes,
whether it?
sir. Yes. Yes.
Okay. Um, how? Okay. Okay. Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes.
But then it becomes not very visible to me. That's the problem. Okay. No, no problem. So this is the context in which we talk about literature and sexuality. And my intention is to invite attention to three important literary works to give you some idea of how a debate or an engagement with the sexuality decided the destiny of these literary works. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to invite you to two important literary works. One is a novel named Awakening, written by Kate Chopin, an American writer who was born in 1850 and died in 1904. Are you familiar with this work? I think these days some of the uh, feminist studies or women's studies departments do prescribe this particular literary work. So I don't know if any of you are teaching this work at the moment. The work I'm referring to is The Awakening by Kate Chopin.
Sir, these works are prescribed in the University of
Pardon?
Calcutta. These works are prescribed for study for the students
Okay, okay.
in the
So,
Calcutta University,
so
sir.
most of you are very familiar with the work of Kate Chopin. And so you might also be teaching the history of these works. In the case of Kate Chopin's novel, it was perhaps one of the earliest literary work, especially a literary work by a woman, in which the main character leaves her secure, comfortable home for her self fulfillment, which even involved her having physical relationships with the men other than her husband. And the general conclusion was that the author, who had already published many short stories, had degraded herself by writing a sex novel. This was the criticism that was raised against K. Chopin. Not only that, in fact, the novel literally ended her otherwise successful literary career. In fact, according to some of the biographers, she couldn't publish another work because most of the publishers shied away from her works. So they were not ready to publish any more of her writings. The next work I'm referring to is very familiar to all of you because Dr. Susi Taru, my own guru, had done an elaborate discussion of this work in her introduction to women writing in India. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this work. The work I'm referring to is a long epic poem, Radhika Santwanam, by a courtesan who lived in uh, late 18th and late 18th century called Mudupalani. And the moment printing press became popular in India, it was published. It was published in 1883 and it was republished in 1907. And at least the literary critics of that time considered it as a literary gem. But it was the British who banned the book then the book was republished in 1910 by Bangalore Nagaratma, who was another courtesan, and it was banned by the British in 1911 on charges of obscenity. Precisely because the book was talking about a woman's sensual bodily pleasures. This is why it was not considered worth uh, worth reading. Okay. Then I go on to the next important work, that is by again a well-known novelist of that time. Her name was Margaret Antonia Radcliffe Hall. And the book is called The Well of Loneliness, which perhaps was the first novel to talk about a relationship that can be explicitly called a lesbian relationship. That is a sensual, romantic relationship between two women. But we should also remember that the novel had just one line that referred to body or sensuality. At one point, it talks about its protagonist and says she kissed her for the first time as a lover. This is the only statement in the novel that explicitly referred to a physical, sensual relationship. But a British court judged the novel as obscene, and the American publishers of the same book had to go through several court battles to get it to sell the book. So very frequently there will be a ban order coming. Then the publishers by this time will go to the court and they'll fight the battle. Somehow the prohibition is removed. It is again brought back to the market. Then there comes again another charge of obscenity, etc., etc. So you can get a clear picture of how references to sexuality literally spoiled the future of a literary work at a particular time in recent history. It also explains why many other writers either shied away from writing openly about sexuality or preferred to speak in a language that is more implicit and least explicit. You know how Emily Dickinson has been writing. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant is her policy. Okay. So now we look at then in what context sexuality became a part of literary discussions. We can see that the earliest to open up on the question of sexuality, the need to discuss art and literature in connection with sexuality, were the feminists and also the later feminist debates, perhaps after the second wave of feminism, when the feminist theorists argued or realized the need to talk about female agency and desire. In fact, these are the times when books like uh, the one which Awakening were brought up and re-recognized as literary classics. For a long time, they were completely forgotten, but these people brought the book back. And you can also see how Nagaratna published the book again, and Dr. Susi Tharu again brought the book back, that is Radhika Sandwanam, and recirculated these books. Around the same time, or maybe a little later, there came another social movement called the gay and lesbian movement. All of us perhaps know the beginning of the gay and lesbian movement is supposedly with the Stonewall Rebellion of 1969, I think. Pardon? Was somebody saying something? Please. Okay, there's something else. No? Is somebody asking a question?
No, sir.
No. Okay, sorry. Okay, so with the gay and lesbian studies of so immediately after the gay and lesbian movement, there came this academic version of the gay lesbian movement called the gay lesbian studies. And that is another academic forum that opened up the possibility of discussing sexuality in connection with literature. But there were certain limitations for these two avenues that became open for the debates on sexuality and its connection with literature. While feminist debates were primarily engaging with it as a statement about female agency, the gay lesbian studies were looking at it as a minority characteristic, assuming or accepting the commonsensical view that gay and lesbian people are actually a kind of a minority, some kind of a ethnic group or something like that. But with the 1990s, the scenario changed drastically with what can be considered as the emergence of a new theoretical framework, which subsequently came to be known as queer theory. So for the rest of my discussion, I shall be focusing on the possibilities opened by queer theory and also the challenges that are being faced at the moment by queer theory. So, how was queer theory different from gay and lesbian studies? The main difference is that queer theory was a mixture of different kinds of studies, different methodologies, different approaches, different perspectives. And the only thing that was common for this variety of methodologies was a critical focus on heteronormativity. In other words, we can say that what patriarchy was for feminism, heteronormativity was for the queer debates. It took an antagonistic stand for, against a social attitude, a commonsensical perspective that was based on seeing heteropatriarchy or heterosexuality as normal, real, and proper. So, this is the only characteristic that distinguishes queer theory. Otherwise, it undertakes all kinds of methodologies, all kinds of perspectives. It basically challenges the essentialist views of sexuality and gender. So it's more of a fighting position, which is questioning all essentialist nature or all essentialist perspectives, especially connected with sexuality and gender. Instead, it examines gender variations and non-heterosexual practices. So, in a way, we can say that queer theory does not construct or defend any particular identity. Here, perhaps the difference between gay and lesbian studies and queer studies will become evident. Gay and lesbian studies assume a stable identity called gay or lesbian. But queer theory does not construct any such identities. It does not even defend any particular kind of identity. Instead, it is questioning any attempt to concretize identities, concretize desires. It liberates identity and desire from any kind of fixed molds or norms. So it is taking, in a way, it is taking a fresh look at the world, refusing to see the world as heterosexual men and heterosexual women. It is trying to look at the infinite variety of human beings and infinite variety of human desires. That is why many people consider queer theory and queer perspective as essentially a liberating one, claiming any human being's right to be whoever and whatever they wish to be. And this is the queer, because a lot of people keep asking me what is the difference between LGBTQ and why Q is added into this thing, etc., etc. So here I'm providing the answer. What exactly is the queer perspective? Now, what exactly is sexuality? And what persuades queer theory to, sorry, there's a mistake. What persuades queer theory to look at sexuality as something like the rainbow of a flag? Because as all of us know, sexual aspects or sexual acts or even sexual desires have many facets. You should remember that sexuality is a form of communication. Any act of sexuality is a form of communication that is transpires between two or more human beings, or one human being and someone or something else. So it is a form of communication. And sexuality in recent times have also been a design for identification. Literally everyone who is sitting in front of this my computer now have a particular name to describe themselves in connection with their sexuality. But we also know that these tags, the very act of this naming has has been just borrowed from the superstructure, from the social formations. Still, it is a design for identification. And then most of us also understand sexuality as a scheme, a plan for pleasure. See, in all these areas, you see there are many complexities. Pleasure does not always mean what is simply understood in the normal language as pleasing. Pleasure can be a pleasure can be experienced in terms of pain, violence, etc. So, pain, violence, etc., have been part of some people's or many people's scheme of pleasure. So, that also has to be understood. So, that is one reason why I often believe that sexuality, uh, most of the times the term sexuality is discussed by people who are partially anarchist and who believe that we should move into a world without any rules and all that. But unfortunately, I believe that there is a need to practice ethics in connection with sexuality. But how to define that ethics, that is what need to be rethought in the context of queer theory. Anyway, social attitudes towards sexuality, that is, imaginations about norms, are informed by contextual incarnations of the patriarchal heterosexist order. That is how it happens in most of the societies. That social attitudes are defined by contextual incarnations, because they are born again in a context, interacting with the contextual elements. And so fundamentally, in most of the societies, the imaginations about the norms are defined by heterosexism in patriarchy. And that is why we now use the term heteropatriarchy. That is a term currently used. Now, going into queer theory, the term was coined by Teresa de Lauretis at a working conference on theorizing lesbian and gay sexualities in 1990. And very soon it became a new branch of study or theoretical speculation. And this is something I've already said. Gay and lesbian studies focus largely on questions of homosexuality, whereas queer theory looks at, studies, and has a political critique of anything that falls into normative and deviant categories, particularly sexual activities and identities. And what is the assumption that keeps queer theory function? Queer theory insists that all sexual behaviors, all concepts linking sexual behaviors to sexual identities, and all categories of normative and deviant sexualities are just social constructs. It rejects the idea that sexuality is an essentialist category, something determined by biology. So, what is sexuality? Sexuality has to be seen as a complex array of social codes and forces, forms of individual activity and institutional power, which interact to shape the ideas of what is normative and what is deviant at any particular moment. So, sexuality, we can never expect the same kind of sexual identities to exist in, say, after 200 years. Sexual identities and even sexual imaginations are extremely contextually specific, and they are articulated through a particular codes, to the codes which become available in any specific social cultural context. And that is why we need to have a fresh look at the whatever is considered as sexuality. So, what are the new challenges to queer studies? I say this because in many contexts like that of India, nowadays we use the queer as a synonym for, say, homosexual or bisexual or transgender. So, what are the new challenges faced by queer theory? And what are the problems when we simply take it as a kind of a synonym of uh, gay or lesbian? One of the things that has been emphasized by many queer theories is the importance of context in queer academic practices. In fact, many of the young researchers from colleges in Kerala quite often come and they want to do a queer reading of a queer writer. In the case of a queer writer, a queer reading has not much relevance because you are just doing a queer reading of whatever is obviously queer. So one of the important thing is that the context and the importance of context in which you engage in a queer research. And it's also important to look at or look around the meanings and functions of the word queer in a particular context. In fact, this was raised by some of the Norwegian scholars who were working on queer theory. In a Euro-American context, the term queer was reclaimed as a political term. Because at least a century back, the term queer was being used as a term of insult to people, towards people who could not fit into the heteropatriarchal model of gender or sensual preferences. That's the way queer was being used. So recovering it as a term for empowerment was politically very, very significant in that context. Whereas some of these Norwegian people were arguing that in the Norwegian context, the term queer is a completely new one. So in that context, when we use the term queer theory, does it really get the political political sharpness that it acquires in an English speaking context. So it's also important, I think, in the case of India, and that is perhaps one of the reasons why, in a context like that of India, where the queer was simply written into what was earlier gay, lesbian, or bisexual. The political potential of the term, in fact, was somewhat blunted in the way in which it has been used in the Indian context. Another thing is, the term queer was so politically important in Western societies, which had been uniformly or almost uniformly reconstructed by uh, industrial capitalism. Whereas in societies like that of India, which are still somewhere in between modernizing effects of capitalism and a provincial lifestyles evolving from feudal backgrounds, the reformulation of human identities are far more complexly dispersed. So, in fact, when we use something like queer theory in such a context, we need to adapt the term to address the specific socio-cultural situations in our societies. In fact, it's extremely difficult even to talk about an Indian society as if it is some kind of a monolith and an Indian sexuality. And that is the reason why the term queer, when used in India, one has to be more cautious. And the next important issue is the temporalities of non-normative desires. Am I going too fast? I'm trying to say the whole thing so that we can open up the discussions. That is why I'm
No,
going a
sir.
little fast.
No,
I
sir.
hope,
It's okay.
yeah, you're good. So what do I mean by temporalities of non-normative desires? The sensual desires, as well as our frameworks for self-identification, are invariably temporal. They have a very powerful temporal dimension. In other words, they are time-based. Because conceptualizing our own desires and our identities can be done only in a language and framework of thought available within a social formations. So what happens is, today, if people with non-normative desires or identifications also imagine their desires within the models available within our social formations. In fact, we can actually see that there is a great deal more experimentation in our urban metropolitan context, where there is greater exposure to different types of human identities and different kinds of social formations. Whereas when we move to more closed societies, there is lesser experimentation, precisely because there is lesser language available, lesser terms available, lesser complexity of human imagination available. So as a result, one of the important challenge of queer studies now is to pay particular attention to the temporalities of normative desires. And the next is the spatial context of queer formations. Just as I said temporal, there are also spatial contexts of queer formation. It's not that everywhere the queer identity is the same. I say this precisely because, when the Western perceptions about queerness came to Indian societies like India, uh, one of the problems was that those Western terminology became broadly accepted, and they became the language through which identities and practices in our societies were recognized and conceptualized. So, the spatial nature of desire and identification also has to be taken into consideration. And finally, and this is being articulated all over the world, perceptions and readings around race, ethnicity, and class also need to be incorporated in our explorations of in our research on gender as well as sexual imaginations. So these are some of the new challenges faced by the problem of contextualization of the queer. Now it is 4:20 according to my computer. So I think now I am here to respond to your observations, reactions, etc.